My sister let me pay off her loans, then she humiliated me behind my back. So I made her regret ever accepting my help. I'm 28, and 6 months ago I discovered that my sister had been mocking me to her friends as a pathetic loser with no life after I'd spent 2 years paying off her $44,000 student loan debt. What she didn't know was that I'd kept detailed records of every payment, and when I finally decided to collect what she owed me, it destroyed her perfect life in ways she never saw coming. To understand what happened, you need to know about my relationship with my sister Lily and why her betrayal cut so deep. Lily is 3 years younger than me, and growing up, I was the protective older brother who always looked out for her. When kids at school bullied her for being shy, I'd step in and handle the situation. When she needed help with homework, I'd spend hours explaining math concepts and helping her write essays until she understood them completely. When she wanted to quit violin lessons because they were too hard, I convinced her to stick with it and even paid for extra practice sessions with money from my part-time job at the local grocery store. This pattern of me helping Lily continued throughout our childhood and teenage years. I'd drive her to friends' houses, cover for her when she missed curfew, and even lend her money for clothes and social activities when our parents said no to her requests. I genuinely enjoyed being the big brother she could rely on, and I took pride in her successes because I felt like I'd contributed to them. I've always been what you'd call financially responsible, probably to a fault. I worked through high school stocking shelves and bagging groceries, saved every penny I could, and graduated debt-free thanks to academic scholarships and careful budgeting throughout college. I chose a practical major in computer science, lived in the cheapest dorms, ate ramen more nights than I care to remember, and graduated with a 3.8 GPA and zero student loan debt. By the time I landed my first job as a software engineer at 22, I'd already developed habits of saving, budgeting, and living below my means that would serve me well throughout my 20s. By age 25, I'd saved enough for a down payment on a modest house and had built up a solid emergency fund of about $60,000. I'm not rich by any means, but I'm comfortable because I make smart decisions with money and don't spend impulsively on things I can't afford. I drive a reliable used car that I bought with cash. I cook most of my meals at home, and I research every major purchase thoroughly before committing to it. Lily, on the other hand, chose what I can only describe as the expensive route through life. She decided to attend our state university, which was reasonable, but then made a series of costly choices that dramatically increased her education expenses. She lived in the most expensive dormitories available, chose meal plans that cost twice as much as the basic options, and studied abroad twice during her undergraduate years, once in Italy and once in France, at a cost of about $15,000 per trip. During her sophomore year, she changed her major from business administration to art history, which meant she had to take additional courses and extend her time in school. She also took out extra loans to cover living expenses because she preferred focusing entirely on her studies rather than working part-time jobs like I had done. She frequently justified these decisions by saying that college was an investment in her future and that she deserved to enjoy the full university experience. By the time Lily finished her 4-year degree, she had accumulated $44,000 in student loan debt with no clear career path and limited practical work experience. Our parents had helped as much as they could afford, contributing about $20,000 per year toward her education costs, but they weren't wealthy enough to cover the full expense of her choices, especially with all the study abroad programs and premium living arrangements she'd selected. When Lily graduated with her art history degree, the job market reality hit her hard. She moved back into her childhood bedroom at our parents' house and started working at a local art gallery for $28,000 per year. The work was part-time and inconsistent, with her income varying based on gallery sales and special events. Meanwhile, her student loan payments were $465 per month, which represented nearly 25% of her take-home pay after taxes. Within 6 months of graduation, Lily was completely overwhelmed by her financial situation. She was living paycheck to paycheck, unable to afford basic social activities with her college friends, and constantly stressed about making ends meet. The interest on her loans was accumulating faster than she could pay it down, and she'd calculated that at her current payment rate, it would take her 15 years to pay off the debt completely. Even worse, she'd end up paying over $70,000 in total due to interest compounding over that extended time frame. The breaking point came during a family dinner about 8 months after her graduation. Lily broke down crying at the table, explaining that she felt trapped and hopeless about her financial future. She talked about how her friends from college were starting careers, moving to new cities, and beginning independent adult lives while she was stuck living with our parents and barely scraping by financially. "I can't live like this, Ben," she said through tears. I can barely afford gas for my car after making my loan payments. I can't go out with friends, I can't save any money, and I'm never going to be able to move out of mom and dad's house. I feel like my life is on hold indefinitely. Watching my little sister struggle like that was heartbreaking. Despite the poor financial decisions she'd made during college, she was still the same person I'd always protected and helped throughout our lives. I also knew that our parents were feeling stressed about having her living at home indefinitely. They were too polite and loving to say anything directly, but I could tell they were worried about her becoming financially dependent on them long term. After thinking about her situation for about a week, I made what I believed was a generous and loving decision that would solve multiple problems at once. I offered to pay off her entire student loan debt, all $44,000, with the understanding that she'd pay me back gradually at 0% interest once she got her financial situation stabilized and her career established. I don't want you drowning in debt for the next 15 years, I told her during a private conversation in my living room. Pay me back when you can, at whatever pace works for your budget. No interest, no pressure, no specific timeline. Just focus on building your career and becoming financially independent. The relief and gratitude on Lily's face were immediate and overwhelming. She hugged me tightly and cried again, but this time from happiness and relief rather than despair. She told me I was the best brother in the world and promised that she'd pay me back as quickly as possible. She said she'd never forget how much I'd helped her and that she'd make sure to help me someday if I ever needed it. I wrote a check for $44,000 from my savings account the following week, which represented about 18 months of careful saving and budgeting on my part. It was a significant portion of my emergency fund, but I told myself it was an investment in my sister's future and our family's overall well-being. I also convinced myself that having the debt within the family was better than having it owed to an impersonal loan company that would charge high interest rates and have no flexibility if she encountered financial difficulties. The immediate results of paying off her loans seemed overwhelmingly positive and confirmed that I'd made the right decision. Within a month, Lily was able to move into her own apartment with a roommate, splitting rent on a nice 2-bedroom place in a good neighborhood. She seemed less stressed and more confident about her future, and she started taking on freelance graphic design work to supplement her gallery income. Her mood improved dramatically, and she began talking about career goals and plans for building her professional skills. For the first 6 months after I'd paid off her debt, Lily would update me regularly on her financial progress and frequently express gratitude for my help. She'd text me when she got new freelance clients, when she received positive feedback at the gallery, and when she hit small financial milestones like saving her first $1,000 in a personal emergency fund. These updates made me feel good about my decision and reinforced my belief that I'd helped my sister get her life on track. But as time went on, I started noticing subtle changes in Lily's behavior and lifestyle that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Her social media posts showed her eating at expensive restaurants, taking weekend trips to nearby cities, and buying designer clothes and accessories that seemed inconsistent with someone who should be focused on paying back a substantial debt. When I'd see her at family gatherings, she'd be wearing new outfits and talking about social activities that clearly cost significant money. When I gently bring up the topic of loan repayment during family gatherings or phone conversations, Lily's responses became increasingly evasive and defensive. She'd say she was working on it and needed more time to get financially established before she could start making meaningful payments. She'd mention unexpected expenses like car repairs or work clothes, or talk about investing in professional development opportunities that would help her career in the long run. These conversations started following a predictable pattern that left me feeling frustrated and unheard. I'd ask a straightforward question about her repayment timeline or her current financial situation, and she'd respond with vague reassurances followed by immediate subject changes. She'd promised to sit down soon and work out a specific payment plan, but these conversations never actually happened despite my repeated attempts to schedule them. After 18 months had passed without a single payment toward the $44,000 I'd lent her, I was becoming seriously concerned about both her intentions and her character. Not $1 had been repaid, despite her increased income from freelance work and her apparent ability to afford an upgraded lifestyle. Meanwhile, I was driving a 10-year-old Honda Civic and living in a modest apartment because I depleted a significant portion of my savings to help her. I was starting to feel resentful about the situation, but I didn't want to create family drama or be seen as the money-obsessed brother who couldn't support his sister's success. I kept my growing concerns to myself and hoped that Lily would eventually start honoring her commitment to pay me back once she felt more financially secure. The breaking point came exactly 2 years after I had paid off her student loans. My college friend Jake was getting married, and Lily was invited to the wedding since she'd known him through me for several years. The wedding was held at an upscale venue about an hour from our hometown, and the reception was exactly the kind of event where people tend to drink too much and share stories they probably shouldn't. During the cocktail hour, I was talking with a group of old college friends near the bar when Jake's new wife approached our conversation circle. She'd clearly had a few drinks and was in that overly social mood that alcohol sometimes creates at wedding receptions. "Oh, Benjamin, you have to hear what your sister was saying earlier," she said with a big smile. "She was telling us the most hilarious stories about you. She said you're like this pathetic loser who has no life outside of work and no girlfriend, so you just throw money at people to try to buy their affection. She was describing how you paid off all her student loans because you're so desperate for someone to think you're important." I felt like I'd been physically struck. The noise of the reception seemed to fade into the background as I processed what she'd just told me. She said what exactly? "Don't worry, we all know she was just joking around and being dramatic for entertainment," Jake's wife continued, apparently oblivious to my reaction. "But she had our whole table cracking up with her impression of you counting your money and living like some kind of hermit who's afraid to spend anything on himself. She made it sound like you're this sad, lonely guy whose highlight of the year was writing her a big check." I excused myself from the conversation and spent several minutes walking around the reception venue, trying to calm down and decide how to handle what I just learned. Eventually, I spotted Lily near the dance floor, laughing and talking with a group of people I didn't recognize. She was clearly having a great time, holding a cocktail and gesticulating animatedly while telling some kind of story. As I got closer to her group, I could hear fragments of her conversation, and what I heard made my blood run cold. "The funniest part is that he actually thinks I'm going to pay him back someday," she was saying to the group of strangers. Like, hello, it was obviously a gift whether he wants to admit it or not. "I'm not paying back money he gave me just because he's too socially awkward to form real relationships with people." Someone in the group made a comment about how generous it was of me to help family, and Lily's response completely shattered any remaining illusion I had about our relationship and her character. "Generous? Are you kidding me?" She laughed. "He did it because he literally has nothing else in his life. No girlfriend, no hobbies, no friends outside of his computer programming job. Paying for my student loans was probably the most exciting and meaningful thing that's happened to him in years. I'm honestly doing him a favor by letting him feel important and needed for once." The group was laughing along with her story, clearly entertained by her portrayal of me as some kind of pathetic, socially inept loser whose generosity was actually evidence of my desperation for human connection. I stood there for several more minutes, listening to my sister mock and humiliate me to complete strangers while they laughed at my expense. I realized in that moment that my sister, who I'd sacrificed 18 months of careful savings to help, was treating my generosity as a joke and using it as material to entertain people at parties. She wasn't just ungrateful for my help, she was actively mocking me as a pathetic loser whose kindness was evidence of my inadequacy rather than my love for her. More devastating than her cruelty was the realization that this probably wasn't the first time she'd told these stories about me. How many people had she entertained with tales of her sad, lonely brother who threw money at people because he couldn't form real relationships? How long had she been using my generosity as evidence of my social failures? I left the wedding reception that night without confronting Lily or saying goodbye to anyone. I drove home in a state of shock and anger, processing the fact that my relationship with my sister had been built on lies and that she'd been taking advantage of my love for her while mocking me behind my back. But as I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, I made a decision that would change everything between us. I wasn't going to let this betrayal slide. I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't heard what she'd said. And I certainly wasn't going to continue being the generous, understanding brother who enabled her to treat me with such contempt. Lily had shown me exactly what she thought of me and our arrangement. Now it was time for her to learn what consequences looked like. I didn't confront Lily at the wedding. Instead, I went home that night and spent hours thinking about what I'd heard and what it meant about our relationship. The more I reflected, the more I realized that Lily's behavior over the past 2 years made perfect sense if she'd never intended to pay me back and had always seen my help as confirmation of my desperation rather than my generosity. The expensive dinners, weekend trips, and designer purchases weren't signs that she was being irresponsible with money. They were signs that she'd never considered my loan to be a real debt that needed to be repaid. In her mind, I'd given her $44,000 because I was a lonely loser who needed to buy people's affection, not because I was a loving brother making a financial sacrifice to help family. I spent the next week documenting everything I could remember about our loan arrangement. Fortunately, I'm naturally organized and had kept detailed records of the transaction. I had the original bank transfer showing the $44,000 payment to her loan servicer, email exchanges where we discussed the repayment terms, and text messages where she'd acknowledged the debt and promised to pay me back. More importantly, I started investigating Lily's current financial situation. Through social media and conversations with family members, I pieced together a picture of someone who was living comfortably on a combined income of about $42,000 per year from her gallery job and freelance work. She'd been earning enough to make meaningful payments toward her debt for over a year, but had chosen to spend that money on lifestyle upgrades instead. That's when I decided to take action. Not out of spite or revenge, but because I'd enabled Lily's behavior long enough, and it was time for her to face consequences for treating my generosity with such contempt. I started by consulting with a lawyer about my options for recovering the debt. Since I had documentation of the loan agreement and her acknowledgement of the terms, I had a strong legal case for collection. The lawyer explained that I could pursue wage garnishment, asset seizure, or other legal remedies if Lily refused to cooperate with a repayment plan. But I decided to try a more personal approach first. I crafted a formal demand letter that laid out exactly what Lily owed me, included documentation of our original agreement, and gave her 30 days to propose a realistic repayment schedule or face legal action. The letter was professional but firm. I included a complete accounting of the $44,000 I'd paid, calculated that at a reasonable 5% annual interest rate she now owed approximately $48,400, and made it clear that her 2 years of non-payment and mockery had convinced me that voluntary repayment was unlikely without legal pressure. I also included printouts of some of her social media posts showing expensive purchases and trips, along with a note that these expenditures demonstrated her ability to make loan payments if she chose to prioritize her obligations over her lifestyle preferences. The final paragraph was the most important. Your recent comments about my motivations for helping you and your assumption that this debt would never need to be repaid have convinced me that our previous informal arrangement was insufficiently structured. Going forward, this will be treated as a standard loan with documented terms and legal enforceability. I sent the letter via certified mail to ensure she couldn't claim she'd never received it. Lily's response was immediate and explosive. She called me within hours of receiving the letter, screaming about how I was trying to destroy her life over money and accusing me of being vindictive and controlling. "You can't just decide to charge me interest now," she yelled. "That wasn't part of our original deal. Our original deal was that you'd pay me back when you could," I replied calmly. "It's been 2 years, and you haven't made a single payment. Meanwhile, you've been spending money on vacations and designer clothes while telling people I'm a pathetic loser who gave you money because I'm desperate for affection. I never said that. I heard you at Jake's wedding, Lily. I heard exactly what you said about me and our arrangement." There was a long silence before she tried a different approach. "Look, I'm sorry if I said some things I shouldn't have. I was drinking and trying to be funny. But this whole legal threat thing is crazy. We're family. Family doesn't mock each other to strangers after accepting massive financial help. Family doesn't treat generosity as evidence of pathetic desperation. And family certainly doesn't ignore debt obligations for 2 years while living beyond their means." The conversation ended with Lily hanging up on me, but I knew the message had been delivered. She now understood that I was serious about collecting what she owed me and that her 2 years of free riding were over. Over the next 2 weeks, I got calls from various family members who Lily had apparently contacted to pressure me into dropping my demands. My parents were particularly upset, asking how I could threaten my own sister with legal action over money. "I'm not threatening her," I explained to my mother. "I'm giving her the opportunity to honor the commitment she made when she accepted my help. If she chooses not to honor that commitment, then yes, I'll pursue legal remedies. But you know she can't afford to pay you back that much money. She can afford to take expensive vacations and buy designer handbags. She can afford to make loan payments if she chooses to prioritize her obligations over her lifestyle preferences." What my family didn't understand was that this wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about Lily learning that actions have consequences and that treating people badly eventually catches up with you. She'd spent 2 years taking advantage of my generosity while mocking me behind my back. It was time for that behavior to have real costs. 3 weeks after my demand letter, Lily came to my apartment unannounced. She looked exhausted and stressed in a way I'd never seen before. "We need to talk," she said. "I can't live like this anymore." "What specifically do you want to talk about?" "I'll start making payments, okay? I'll pay you back. Just drop the legal stuff and give me some time to figure out a payment plan." "What changed your mind?" She was quiet for a long time before admitting the truth. "I talked to a lawyer. He said you have a really strong case and that I could end up having my wages garnished or my assets seized if this goes to court. I can't afford to have that on my credit report." That conversation was the beginning of a repayment plan, but it was also the end of our relationship as I'd previously known it. Lily was no longer my little sister who I'd helped out of love. She was someone who'd taken advantage of my generosity and only agreed to honor her obligations when faced with legal consequences. We worked out a repayment schedule where she'd pay me $700 per month for the next 6 years to cover the principal plus reasonable interest. It was a significant portion of her income, but manageable if she eliminated the expensive lifestyle she'd been living at my expense. But even as we negotiated the terms, I could see the resentment in her eyes. She wasn't grateful for my willingness to work with her or apologetic for her behavior. She was angry that I'd forced her to face consequences for her actions. Lily has been making her monthly payments for the past year and a half, but our relationship remains fundamentally changed and will probably never recover. The first few payments came on time, but I could tell from her social media that the financial pressure was affecting her life significantly. No more expensive dinners, no more weekend trips, no more designer purchases. She'd moved to a smaller, cheaper apartment and was clearly living much more modestly than she had been during her 2 years of non-payment. More importantly, her attitude toward me had changed completely. The casual dismissiveness and mockery were gone, replaced by careful politeness that felt like she was walking on eggshells around me. Family gatherings became tense affairs where Lily would barely speak to me directly and would leave early whenever possible to avoid extended interaction. My parents were initially disappointed in how I'd handled the situation, but they couldn't argue with the results. Lily was finally taking responsibility for her financial obligations, even if it required legal pressure to make it happen. Over time, they've also started to understand the depth of her betrayal and the reasonableness of my response. "I just wish you could have worked this out without threatening her," my mother said during one conversation early in the process. "I tried working it out for 2 years," I replied. Lily chose to ignore her obligations and mock me to strangers instead. This is the consequence of that choice. The most significant validation came when other family members learned the full story of what Lily had been saying about me. Initially, some relatives had criticized me for being too harsh with my sister. But as word spread about her mocking comments and how long she'd been taking advantage of my generosity, public opinion shifted decisively in my favor. My aunt pulled me aside at a family barbecue 6 months into the repayment plan and said something that confirmed I'd made the right decision. "I had no idea Lily had been treating you that way. You did the right thing by making her face consequences." Someone needed to teach her that actions matter, and apparently her parents weren't going to do it. During a recent family dinner, Lily made a comment that revealed how she really feels about the situation. When someone mentioned a news story about student loan forgiveness programs, Lily said bitterly, "Some people are lucky enough to have their loans forgiven by the government. Others have family members who treat them like loan sharks over money they gave as gifts." That comment confirmed that Lily still doesn't understand what she did wrong. In her mind, I'm the villain who forced her to honor a debt she never really intended to pay. She sees herself as the victim of my unreasonable expectations rather than someone who took advantage of my generosity and faced appropriate consequences for that behavior. But that comment actually made me feel better about my decision. It proved that Lily hadn't learned anything meaningful from this experience and would have continued taking advantage of me indefinitely if I hadn't forced the issue through legal pressure. I also learned through family connections that Lily's social circle has changed dramatically since she can no longer afford to maintain her artificially inflated lifestyle. The people who used to laugh at her jokes about my pathetic generosity apparently aren't as interested in her company when she can't contribute to expensive group activities and weekend trips. She's been complaining that her friends don't invite her to things anymore, my cousin told me recently. Apparently, when you can't afford to split $150 dinner bills and weekend getaway costs, people stop including you in their social circle. There's poetic justice in that outcome. Lily lost friends because she couldn't afford to maintain the lifestyle she'd been funding with money that should have been repaying her debt to me. Meanwhile, I've been rebuilding my savings and have developed stronger relationships with family members who respect how I handled a difficult situation with integrity and appropriate boundaries. The experience taught me several important lessons that have made me a stronger and more discerning person. First, I learned that generosity without boundaries isn't kindness, it's enabling. By giving Lily $44,000 with no structured repayment plan and no consequences for non-payment, I created a dynamic where she could take advantage of my love without facing any real costs. Second, I learned that some people will always interpret kindness as weakness and generosity as desperation. Lily's mocking comments weren't just cruel jokes. They revealed her fundamental character and how she really viewed our relationship. In her mind, my willingness to help her was evidence of my inadequacy rather than my love for her. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong in a relationship. I noticed Lily's expensive lifestyle and lack of payment progress months before discovering her true attitude toward our arrangement. I should have addressed those concerns directly instead of hoping she'd eventually do the right thing voluntarily. Lily still has 4.5 years left on her repayment schedule, and I doubt our relationship will ever recover from her betrayal and my response to it. She's never apologized for mocking me or acknowledged that her behavior was wrong. She's simply complying with the repayment terms because legal consequences forced her to do so. I'm completely okay with that outcome. I don't need her gratitude or acknowledgement to know I did the right thing. The $44,000 I lent her represented a significant personal sacrifice that deserved respect, not mockery. When she chose to treat my generosity with contempt and use it as entertainment material for strangers, she chose the consequences that followed. My savings account is steadily rebuilding, and I've learned to be much more careful about mixing family relationships with financial arrangements. I still help people I care about, but with clear terms, documented agreements, and realistic expectations about human nature and the potential for people to take advantage of kindness. The experience fundamentally changed how I view family relationships and personal boundaries. Some people think I was too harsh in enforcing the debt collection, but Lily had 2 years to honor her commitment voluntarily and chose instead to mock me while living beyond her means at my expense. Legal pressure was the only language she understood, and it's the only reason she's taking responsibility for her obligations now. What do you think? Was I right to hold my sister accountable for both her debt and her disrespectful behavior, or should family loyalty have trumped everything else? I sometimes wonder if there was a gentler way to handle this situation, but then I remember her describing me as a pathetic loser to strangers at a wedding, and I know I made the right choice.